The film began with a dark and unsettling scene at a university. A male student, driven to the edge of his sanity, stood on the ledge of a high-rise building, preparing to end his life. Professors and security guards rushed to the rooftop, desperate to save him, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. As they neared the ledge, the young man simply took a step into the void, and the film truly began. In a lecture hall, Professor Nietzsche spoke with a captivating intensity, explaining the science and psychology behind insomnia. She described it as a mental disorder caused by extreme stress and anxiety, a condition that could worsen to terrifying degrees. She detailed how a lack of sleep for just 1 or 2 days could begin to affect a person's mental state, but if it stretched to 3, 5, or even longer, it could lead to extreme symptoms like hallucinations and auditory paranoia. The words hung heavy in the air, a chilling foreshadowing of the events to come. The scene shifted to a young woman, a student named Jane, who sat in the lecture hall, struggling to keep her eyes open. She then told the story of her own struggle with insomnia. Years earlier, when she was in middle school, she had gone 3 days without sleep. Her parents had been murdered by criminals, a traumatic event that shattered her life. Afterwards, she and her younger sister, June, went to live with their grandmother. The trauma manifested itself as a constant anxiety about her family's safety. She would often find herself checking the locks over and over again, unable to find peace of mind. To cope with her sleeplessness, Jane had developed a strict and exhausting routine. She would study until 2 a.m., and then, without any rest, she would go to the market at 3 a.m. to buy ingredients for her food business. Her life was a constant cycle of work and worry. One day, a letter arrived, a stark reminder of her family's financial struggles. It was a notice for a late loan payment of 728,000 baht. It was a slap in the face, a reminder of her desperate situation. Jane walked into Professor Nietzsche's office, a heavy heart weighing her down. She was at the end of her rope. She explained her predicament to the professor, telling her that she was going to have to drop out of medical school to find a full-time job and pay off her family's debts. Professor Nietzsche, unwilling to lose one of her best and brightest students, was taken aback. She knew Jane's situation was a long shot, but she offered her a solution. She gave her the number for a German pharmaceutical company called Weimar, a company that was looking for volunteers for a new medical experiment. Jane, feeling as if she had no other choice, took the offer. She went to the Weimar headquarters, a sleek, modern building that felt cold and sterile. She was met by the company's director, Dr. Hans Miller. He was a cold and calculating man who gave her a detached and clinical explanation of the experiment, which was called the DEEP. He told her that it had 3 levels, each with a different duration and a different payout. The goal of the experiment was to get volunteers to stay awake for as many days as possible to produce a hormone called crotonin. He told her that the higher the level, the more concentrated the hormone would be, and the more money she would get. It was a double-edged sword, a perfect solution to her financial problems, but a great risk to her health. In the end, Jane agreed to participate in level 1. The pay was a life-changing 100,000 baht. After she signed the contract, a small microchip was implanted in her neck to harvest the crotonin hormone from her brain. She was also given a special watch that would track her heart rate and the amount of crotonin she had produced. Her mission would be complete once the watch reached 100%. Before she left, Mr. Hans Miller gave her a final, chilling warning. He said she had to keep the experiment a secret, and she absolutely could not fall asleep for more than 60 seconds. He told her that if she did, the microchip would short-circuit and her heart would stop. It was a terrifying reality, a ticking time bomb she would have to face. That night, as was her nightly routine, Jane sat at her desk, studying. The anxiety began to creep up on her, a familiar and unwelcome feeling. It was an itch she had to scratch. She quietly got up and went to check on her grandmother. When she opened the door, she was scared out of her wits. Her grandmother was lying on the floor, motionless. After a few seconds of pure panic, Jane realized her grandmother was just looking for her dentures that had fallen under the bed. It was a terrifying moment, but it was also a reminder of how much her family meant to her. She loved her grandmother and sister dearly, and they were the only family she had left. A few minutes later, Jane heard a car pull up outside. Her sister June walked in with a man. Jane immediately hit the roof. She was furious with June for not replying to her messages and for being out so late. They had a massive fight that ended with Jane accidentally dropping June's phone, breaking it in the process. The next day at the university, Jane was eating lunch in the cafeteria when she was approached by a student named Win. He was known for being a party animal who cared more about having fun than studying. He immediately came out and said that he knew Jane was a part of the deep experiment, and he told her that he was a volunteer too. Win explained that he had a hard time sleeping because of his party lifestyle. He was always worried about missing out on a good time. He then introduced Jane to two other students who were also a part of the experiment. The first was Sin, a very popular and intelligent social media influencer who was forced by her parents to go to medical school. Because of the pressure, she often had trouble sleeping. The last was Peach, a no-life gamer who was always up late at night playing video games, trying to get to a higher rank. The four of them quickly bonded and became friends, a band of friends united by their sleepless nights. They spent the next 3 days together, keeping each other awake by doing everything they could think of. They would study together, play games, and just talk, anything to keep their eyes on the prize. On the third day, they successfully completed the first level of the experiment and received their money, or it was a weight off their shoulders. They all went on a shopping spree. Jane bought June a new phone and paid off a portion of her debt. The others bought things that were important to them, like a new gaming console and expensive clothes. To celebrate their newfound fortune and to bask in the triumph of their shared success, the four friends decided to form a group chat. Their conversation quickly turned from celebration to ambition. They were addicted to the thrill of the chase, and they wanted more. They decided to conquer every level of the deep experiment, convinced they could get more money and solve all their problems. A few days later, they went back to the Weimar headquarters to meet with Dr. Hans, ready to sign up for level 2. Dr. Hans explained the new terms. The experiment would take longer than level 1, and the crotonin produced would be far more concentrated. The stakes were higher, and the risks were greater. The four friends hesitated, a moment of doubt creeping into their minds. But a moment later, Dr. Hans said the magic words. The payment was 500,000 baht. The number was so massive it took their breath away. They were hooked, line, and sinker. They all began to fantasize about how they would spend the money. Jane imagined her family's debt being completely paid off. Win pictured a life filled with luxury cars. Sin thought about all the fashion brands she could launch. Peach fantasized about a brand new computer with the best gear on the market. In the end, the reward was too great, and they all agreed to participate in level 2. After 3 days, the strain of not sleeping began to show. Win was hit by a severe wave of dizziness. He heard strange voices in his head, a sinister cacophony of whispers and sounds. It was enough to make him fly off the handle and lash out, hitting one of his friends. Jane was not immune to the side effects. She became irritable and snapped at her sister June, an angry outburst that was completely out of character. During a medical practicum, she had a terrifying hallucination. She looked at a cadaver and for a second saw her grandmother lying lifeless on the table. It was a terrifying moment that filled her with a chilling dread. The next day, they all met up to get some food. As they were eating, Jane glanced at Win's watch. She noticed that the percentage on his watch was much higher than her own. Her brilliant mind, though exhausted, put the pieces together. She realized that because Win was a party animal and was constantly moving, he was producing more crotonin. She told her friends that to finish the experiment faster and get the money quicker, they had to be more active. They all agreed, and they decided to have a party at Peach's house to get the job done. That night, to make sure they all stayed awake, Win came up with an idea that sent a chill down their spines. He suggested they mix a stimulant drug into their drinks. Jane was initially hesitant. Her medical mind told her it was far too dangerous. She knew they were playing with fire, but she was also terrified of being the only one to fall asleep and die. In the end, she agreed. With the drinks in their system, they went from bad to worse and began to dance wildly. As the night wore on, Jane began to lose her mind. Her inhibitions were gone, and she was overcome by a powerful impulse. She went to Win, and knowing he had feelings for her, kissed him. It was a fleeting moment of connection in a sea of madness. A moment later, Sin heard strange noises coming from Peach's room. She was filled with a powerful and irresistible curiosity. When she went inside, she was filled with a chilling dread. She saw that Peach had been stalking her. He had pictures of her all over his wall, a creepy shrine to his obsession. It was a moment of pure terror that pushed her over the edge. She immediately passed out. Win and Jane, realizing that Sin was on the verge of death, worked quickly to perform CPR. It was a terrifying moment of fight or flight. They managed to revive her, but she was a different person. She was a basket case, And it was all because of the experiment. The experience was a wake-up call for the group. They all realized that they had to get out, and they had to do it now. The next morning, they went to the Weimar headquarters to see Dr. Hans. They were exhausted, their faces filled with anger and desperation. They told him that they were quitting the experiment. Dr. Hans, a man with no morals, tried to entice them to do level 3. He told them that if they did, he would give them 1 million baht. He told them it was the opportunity of a lifetime, a gilded cage that would solve all their problems. But they had seen firsthand what the experiment could do. It was a fight to the death, and they were not willing to sacrifice their lives for money. They all refused and chose their lives over money. At the university, Peach approached Sin, his face a mask of shame and desperation. He tried to apologize, clumsily explaining that his obsessive behavior was just his way of supporting her. He believed he was trying to love her and help her more than anyone else could. But Sin's trust had been shattered. The memory of his creepy shrine and her near-death experience filled her with a chilling dread. She didn't say a word. She just turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in a cloud of his own misery. On the other hand, Jane's problems were just beginning. Her recent obsession with the experiment had taken a toll on her studies. Her grades, which had once been perfect, began to plummet. She felt like a pressure cooker, with stress and anxiety mounting to an unbearable degree. In a moment of sheer frustration, she lashed out at Win, telling him to stay away from her. She said she had no time for a relationship and needed to focus on her grades. Later that day, on her way home, Jane saw a crowd of people gathered outside a building. Police cars and an ambulance were at the scene. Her heart began to pound in her chest. She pushed her way to the front and saw a body covered with a blanket. She immediately recognized the watch on the person's wrist. It was another volunteer from the deep experiment. Her blood ran cold. The reality of the experiment and the very real dangers of it were now staring her in the face. That night, Jane's world came crashing down. She went to check on her grandmother and found her unconscious on the floor. Filled with panic, she rushed her to the hospital. A short while later, her sister June arrived and handed Jane a bag filled with money for the operation. Jane was confused, unable to comprehend where her little sister could have gotten so much money. And then she saw it, the Weimar logo on the side of the bag. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. June had joined the experiment. Jane immediately erupted in anger, scolding June and ordering her to stop what she was doing. In a separate corner of the city, Win's world was also falling apart. He went home to find his father had thrown away all of his late mother's belongings. The photographs, the clothes, the books, they were all gone. Gone as if they had never existed. They were the only memories he had left of her. He was filled with a deep sense of betrayal. He accused his father of not caring and said he was the reason his mother had died. He was heartbroken, and he felt alone. Back to Jane, she raced to the Weimar company, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and rage. She was ready to confront Dr. Hans and demand he release her sister. But when she got there, she was hit with a gut punch. She saw June sitting across from Dr. Hans, with a brand new watch and the microchip for level 2 already implanted. Dr. Hans had pulled the rug out from under her, and Jane's world began to spin. Jane was filled with pure rage. She threatened to go to the police, but Mr. Hans Miller, a master manipulator, just laughed. He told her that he would never release the microchip from June unless Jane and her friends came back and completed level 3. Jane was in a no-win situation. She knew her friends had already agreed to quit the experiment, but she also knew she couldn't let her sister die. Jane went to see Sin and Peach. She explained the situation to them and begged them to come back and help her save June. They immediately refused, telling her that they had already put their lives on the line and that they were not willing to sacrifice themselves for her. Jane's heart sank. She knew she was asking them to play with fire, but she was in a race against the clock. They saw the despair in her eyes and knew they couldn't leave her to face this all alone. They had become a band of friends, and they were in this for better or for worse. They agreed to participate in level 3. Knowing that level 3 was far too dangerous to do alone, Jane went to see Professor Nietzsche. She told her the truth about the experiment and begged for her help. Professor Nietzsche listened calmly and agreed to help them. She told them she would give them a special extracellular fluid that would keep them from getting tired. She told them to call her immediately if something went wrong. They passed the first 5 days without a problem, but on the 6th day, the lack of sleep started to take a toll on their minds and bodies. The hallucinations came back, but this time they were more terrifying and vivid than before. They were on the verge of losing it. The madness pushed them over the edge.
Dad, แบบเนี้ยก็เพราะมึงคนเดียว
Win and Peach began to argue, and their words turned to violence. They started to fight, their faces filled with rage and despair. Jane, terrified and seeing her friends on the brink of madness, tried to call Professor Nietzsche, but she didn't answer. Jane immediately ran to her office to get help, but when she got there, she was hit by a bus. She saw the lab, the tools, the chemicals. Everything was a lie. Professor Nietzsche was the mastermind behind the entire experiment. She had been playing a long game, and they were all just pawns in her sick and twisted plan. The moment Professor Nietzsche caught her, a chilling look in her eyes, Jane knew she was a dead woman. She ran to where her friends were, only to find the door locked and their phones out of service. They were cornered animals, a fact that sent them into a spiral of madness. On the seventh day, Sin, filled with a desperate rage, began to smash all the CCTV cameras in the room, a defiant act that gave them a moment of false hope. Suddenly, Win collapsed on the floor, his body went limp, and his heart stopped. Jane's heart sank into a pit of despair. She had watched one of her best friends die, and there was nothing she could do. Professor Nietzsche soon entered the room and, without any remorse, took the microchip out of Win's neck. But in a stunning turn of events, Win's body began to move. He got up and, filled with a primal fury, attacked Professor Nietzsche. It was then that Jane revealed her ace up her sleeve. She had not been going crazy. She had been trying to find a way out. She had found a chemical that could stop a person's heart for a few seconds, a substance that caused a temporary heart attack. They had given it to Win to feign death so he could get his microchip removed without dying. It was a Hail Mary pass, a last-ditch effort that worked perfectly. While they had been trapped, they had discovered Professor Nietzsche's entire life story. She had been doing the experiment to save her boyfriend Jade, who had been in a coma for years. Jade had been a scientist who was obsessed with her work, constantly experimenting on himself. She had been a sleepless night, always working on her research. One day, after suffering from a severe case of sleep deprivation, he had hallucinated and in his trance jumped from a building. The accident left him brain dead, and Nietzsche had been in a constant state of grief and despair ever since. She had tried to save Jade with the crotonin produced from her own body, but it had not been enough. She had no other choice. She was on the brink of madness, and she had to save the love of her life. She created the Deep experiment, paying her students a hefty sum to produce a massive amount of crotonin. Her actions, while selfish, were driven by love, a love that turned her into a monster. When Jane and her friends were distracted, Professor Nietzsche, a woman with nothing to lose, surprised them. She grabbed a sedative and, without a moment's hesitation, injected it into Jane. Jane immediately collapsed on the floor, her body going limp. Sin and Peach immediately jumped in, trying to stop Professor Nietzsche. They fought with her, but she was a powerful force of nature, and they struggled to contain her. It was only when Sin grabbed a keyboard and hit her over the head with it that she finally passed out. June and Win went to Jane's side and tried to revive her, but it was no use. The sedative was too strong, and her heart began to stop. She was going to the other side, and there was nothing they could do. They were filled with grief, panic, and despair. They had risked their lives, and now one of their own was dying right in front of them. It was a harrowing moment for them all. June, in a fit of rage and sadness, began to hit her sister's body, yelling at her to wake up. And in a stunning twist of fate, Jane's body began to move. She took a breath, and her heart began to beat again. A few moments later, the police arrived and arrested Professor Nietzsche. The experiment was over. The volunteers had failed to get their money, but it was a small price to pay for their lives. The group had faced death and returned. They were a different kind of rich. They had learned a valuable life lesson that was worth more than 1,000,000 baht. They all decided to go their separate ways and live their own lives. They each found a way to deal with their insomnia and anxiety. Jane and June went on to live a happy life with their grandmother, and Jane was able to finish medical school. The friends chose to live their lives, and they always made sure to get a good night's sleep. They understood that it was better to be alive and healthy than to be in an eternal sleep.